Continuing with topic 2.3, which is over deductive reasoning where we're using facts, we're going to now learn the law of syllogism. The law of syllogism, usually they give you two if-then statements. And then if the if the conclusion from your first statement is the hypothesis from your second statement, then you can actually draw the conclusion that if your first hypothesis is true, your final conclusion is also true. So if you look here, we have an if-then statement. It says if you get a job, then the conclusion is that you will earn money. If you notice, the hypothesis of the next statement is the conclusion, if you earn money. And then from there, it says you will buy a car. So because the conclusion of one statement was the hypothesis of another, we couldn't come up with a new statement. If you get a job, then you will buy a car. That uses the hypothesis of the first with the conclusion of the second. So here, your conclusion of your first statement needs to be the same as your hypothesis from the second. So let's read some statements and see if we can use the law of syllogism to come up with a conclusion. If we can't, then we would just write no valid conclusion. Number 1 says if an angle is supplementary to an obtuse angle, then it is acute. My next statement says if an angle is acute. Notice that matches the conclusion from the first statement. Then it says then its measure is less than 90. Since the conclusion of the first statement was the hypothesis of the next, we can draw a valid conclusion where we use the hypothesis of the first with the conclusion of the last. So if an angle is supplementary to an obtuse angle, then its measure is less than 90. So notice my new statement was just combining the beginning of the first statement with the end of the last statement. And it's like we're taking out that middle part. Question 2 says if a dog eats super dog food, so that's my hypothesis. Let me try to do that in yellow. So if a dog eats super dog food, then he will be happy. My next statement says if Rover is sad. This did not flow from the first statement. So since it has nothing to do right now with the first statement, we can't draw a conclusion from it. So because we can't do that, then there is no valid conclusion. So the second statement would have to flow from the first for this to be able to come up with a conclusion. For us to be able to come up with a conclusion, sorry. Question 3 says if you study for a test, then you will receive a high grade. Our next statement says if you study for a test, then you will get a reward from your parents. Now, these are two if-then statements, but we cannot combine them to use to write a conclusion because both of them are just saying if you study for the test, then this will happen. But we can't say, okay, if you study for the test, something different might happen. There's really nothing new that we can say here. And that's because the hypothesis of our second statement did not flow from the first. So here I would say no valid conclusion. And that's because the hypothesis of the second statement did not match the conclusion from the first. Question 4. Our hypothesis is if you sleep early, the conclusion is then you will eat breakfast. Our next sentence starts with if you eat breakfast. So it's flowing. The conclusion of the first statement flows into the hypothesis of the next one. And then they make a new statement, then you will have energy. So because the conclusion of the first matched the hypothesis of the second, we can write a new statement that says, if you sleep early, then you will have energy. So notice here, it flowed nicely. If your conclusion from your first statement then begins your hypothesis for your next, you can write a new if-then statement that kind of leaves out that middle, that goes from the beginning to the end. From here, from if you sleep early to then you will have energy. So when you're doing the law of syllogism, again, if your conclusion of your first statement is your hypothesis of the second, your new statement will be if hypothesis of first statement, then conclusion from second statement.